Margaret's hands trembled as she clutched the envelope, its contents heavier than any secret she'd ever carried. 30 years of marriage, of shared laughter and quiet sacrifices, now reduced to lies printed in black and white. As the church bells chimed, she glanced at Richard, the man she thought she knew, and wondered, how do you expose a betrayal so vast without shattering everything you've built? Don't miss the shocking twists and emotional journey ahead. Subscribe now to uncover the truth behind Margaret's heartbreaking discovery. The church bell chimed softly, echoing through the quiet town square as sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns onto the polished wooden pews. The baptism was underway, a sacred ceremony celebrating innocence and new beginnings. Yet, for Margaret, this day symbolized something entirely different, a moment of reckoning. She sat at the back of the church, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale against her lavender dress. Her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed a storm of emotions swirling beneath the surface. Her husband, Richard, stood near the altar, beaming with pride as the priest prepared to bless their infant granddaughter. His charm radiated effortlessly, his smile reassuring and warm, but Margaret saw through it now. She saw the lies, the betrayal, and the double life he had so carefully concealed. Her heart raced as she rehearsed the words she had prepared to speak, words that would shatter the illusion of the perfect family and reveal the truth to everyone gathered in the sacred space. Just days earlier, Margaret had stumbled upon the first clue, a late-night phone call that had come while Richard was in the shower. The phone buzzed insistently on the nightstand, and out of instinct, she glanced at the screen. "Marie," the caller ID read, accompanied by a photo of a woman Margaret didn't recognize. She hesitated for a moment before answering, her voice cautious. "Hello?" A woman's voice came through, soft yet urgent. "Richard, is everything okay? You were supposed to call me after the meeting." Margaret froze. Meeting. Her mind raced as she struggled to make sense of the words. Before she could respond, the line went dead, and Margaret was left holding the phone, her breath caught in her chest. She placed the phone back where she found it, her hands trembling. Her heart pounded as she tried to dismiss the unease creeping into her thoughts. Richard had always been devoted, hadn't he? He often traveled for work, but that was part of his job. Surely there was an explanation. But the seeds of doubt had been planted, and as the days went on, they grew into a gnawing suspicion she could no longer ignore. Margaret began to notice things she hadn't before. Richard's evasive answers when she asked about his trips, the cryptic text messages he received, and the way he seemed to avoid her eyes when she brought up anything personal. It was subtle, but once she started looking, the cracks in his facade became glaringly obvious. Margaret wasn't one to jump to conclusions. She had been married to Richard for over 30 years and had built a life based on trust and compromise. But something about the phone call wouldn't let her rest. She decided to investigate quietly, not wanting to alarm anyone just yet. Late at night, after Richard had gone to bed, she sat in the dim glow of her laptop, scrolling through his financial statements and social media accounts. At first, nothing seemed amiss. Then she found it, a hotel receipt tucked into an email folder labeled Personal. It was dated 2 weeks earlier. During a weekend, Richard had claimed to be visiting an old friend out of town. The receipt wasn't for a single room. Her chest tightened as the reality began to sink in. Margaret stared at the screen, her mind swimming with questions. Who was Marie? What kind of life had Richard been leading behind her back? She didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was mounting. Still, she needed more, something concrete that would leave no room for denial. The following morning, Margaret's demeanor was calm and controlled as she prepared breakfast. She watched Richard across the table, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone, oblivious to her growing resolve. She felt a pang of sadness as she studied his face, a face she had once trusted implicitly. "Busy week ahead?" she asked, her voice steady. Richard glanced up briefly and nodded. "Same as usual. Meetings, a little travel. You know how it is." She smiled faintly, though her heart ached. "Of course. Let me know if you need anything." He returned her smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Margaret felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. This wasn't the time. She needed to bide her time, to gather enough evidence to confront him without a shadow of a doubt. By the end of the week, Margaret's suspicions had only deepened. She had hired a private investigator, a quiet but efficient man named Thomas, who promised discretion and results. In less than 48 hours, he provided her with the damning proof she needed. Photos of Richard with another woman, walking hand in hand through a park, their smiles intimate and carefree. Margaret stared at the images, her hands shaking as she clutched the file. There it was, in black and white, her husband's betrayal. Her resolve hardened. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer, but the timing had to be perfect. The baptism was only days away, a gathering of family and friends who had always seen Richard as the devoted husband and father. If she was going to reveal the truth, it would be there, in front of everyone he had fooled for so long. The day of the baptism arrived with deceptive serenity. Margaret awoke early, her mind churning with a mix of dread and determination. She moved through her morning routine as though on autopilot, carefully choosing a lavender dress that symbolized both elegance and strength. Today wasn't just about exposing Richard's betrayal. It was about reclaiming her dignity and setting herself free from the lies that had quietly suffocated her for years. Richard was already dressed and bustling about the house, his usual charm on full display. "You look beautiful," he remarked as Margaret entered the kitchen, his tone as casual as if they were any other couple preparing for a family celebration. Margaret forced a smile, her stomach twisting. How could he lie so easily? How could he pretend everything was normal when his other life loomed so close to discovery? The drive to the church was filled with small talk, mostly about their granddaughter Emma and the ceremony. Margaret responded politely, but her mind was elsewhere, rehearsing what she would say and bracing herself for the fallout. As they pulled into the church parking lot, Margaret's grip on her purse tightened. Inside was the folder Thomas had given her, the evidence that would tear Richard's double life apart. The church was alive with warmth and activity, friends and family greeting one another with hugs and laughter. Margaret's children, Sophie and Mark, waved from the pews, their faces lit with excitement. Sophie held Emma, her face glowing with pride as she adjusted the baby's delicate white gown. Margaret's heart ached for her daughter, who still looked at her father as a hero. Would Sophie hate her for what she was about to do? Would Mark, her ever-loyal son, turn against her when the truth came out? She took her seat beside Richard, who seemed completely at ease, even smug, as he shook hands and shared pleasantries with the guests. Margaret couldn't help but study him, wondering if this man, who had been her partner for 3 decades, had ever truly loved her, or if their entire marriage had been just another one of his performances. The ceremony began, the priest's voice resonating through the quiet sanctuary. Margaret's pulse quickened as the moment she dreaded drew closer. She glanced around the room, at the faces of her family and friends, each of them blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Her hands tightened into fists in her lap, her resolve solidifying. This was the right thing to do. The truth had to come out. Margaret's mind drifted back to the previous evening, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. She had received an unexpected call from Thomas, her private investigator. "There's something else you should know," he had said, his voice careful. "Marie isn't just someone Richard's been seeing. She's his wife, legally. He married her under a different name years ago. They have a home together in another town." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had suspected an affair, but bigamy. The man she had built her life with had been living a second life, complete with another home and another woman who also believed she was the sole Mrs. Richard Moore. Margaret had spent the night staring at the photos and documents Thomas had provided. The marriage certificate with Richard's alias, the photos of him and Marie laughing at a backyard barbecue, the receipts for gifts he'd bought her. The scale of his deception was almost incomprehensible. She felt a deep, simmering anger that gave her the strength to confront him in front of everyone. Now, back in the present, Margaret glanced at Richard, who was watching the priest with what appeared to be genuine reverence. How could he sit here, in a place of worship, with no sign of guilt or remorse? She thought of Marie, who was just as much a victim of his lies as she was. Did she know about Margaret? Did she suspect that her life too was built on a foundation of deceit? The ceremony progressed, the priest calling Sophie and Mark to the front to present Emma for the baptism. Margaret's chest tightened as she realized her moment was approaching. She reached into her purse and touched the folder, her fingers brushing the sharp edges of the evidence that would expose everything. The priest raised his hand in blessing, his voice calm and steady. Margaret rose from her seat, her knees shaking but her heart resolute. "I need to say something," she announced, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. All eyes turned to her, the congregation frozen in confusion and curiosity. Richard's head whipped around, his face paling as he saw the folder in her hands. "Margaret," he hissed under his breath, a warning edge in his tone. But Margaret stood firm. She felt the weight of 30 years of betrayal lifting as she prepared to speak the truth. "This baptism is about new beginnings," she said, her voice steady now. "And I believe in the truth, no matter how painful it is to hear. Richard, you owe everyone in this room the truth about your life." A stunned silence fell over the congregation as Margaret's words echoed through the church. Faces turned toward Richard, who sat frozen, his complexion ashen. Sophie and Mark, standing at the altar with baby Emma, exchanged bewildered glances. The priest hesitated, his outstretched hand suspended mid-air, unsure whether to proceed with the blessing or step aside. Margaret didn't wait for Richard to respond. She opened the folder, pulling out the damning photographs and holding them up for everyone to see. "For years, I believed we had a marriage built on love and trust. But these," she gestured to the photos, "prove otherwise. Richard has been living a double life, married not just to me, but to another woman." Gasps rippled through the pews, disbelief etched on every face. Sophie covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with shock, while Mark stepped forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Mom, what are you talking about?" he asked, his voice trembling. Margaret's voice broke slightly as she looked at her children. "I'm so sorry you had to find out like this, but I couldn't let this go on any longer. Your father isn't the man you think he is." Richard sprang to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. His face was a mixture of anger and desperation. "Margaret, stop this," he snapped. "This isn't the time or place." Margaret turned to him, her gaze unwavering. "The time and place stopped mattering the moment you decided to lie to all of us. If I had waited, you would have kept living this lie, pretending to be a loving husband and father while sneaking off to your other life." Richard took a step toward her, his hands raised as if to calm the situation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low but strained. "It's not what it looks like." Margaret let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Not what it looks like. Thomas found your second marriage certificate, Richard. You're legally married to Marie and have been for years. What part of that am I misunderstanding?" The weight of her words struck like a thunderclap. The congregation erupted into murmurs, whispers rippling through the room like a tide. Sophie's face crumpled as tears spilled down her cheeks, her voice barely a whisper. "Dad, is this true?" Mark, ever the protector, turned to his father, his voice rising. "Answer her. Is this true? You've been married to someone else." Richard's shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked small and defeated. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape. Margaret stepped closer, her voice cutting through the cacophony of whispers. "Tell them, Richard. Tell them the truth, or I will." Before Richard could respond, the doors at the back of the church creaked open. Heads turned as a figure stepped inside, a woman in her early 50s, dressed in a simple yet elegant navy dress. She carried herself with an air of quiet dignity, but her face was etched with tension. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. It was Marie. The murmurs grew louder as the realization rippled through the room. Marie stood frozen for a moment, her eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Richard. "I didn't want to believe it," she said softly, her voice trembling. "But now I see it's true." Richard's face twisted in panic. "Marie, you don't understand." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Marie interrupted, her voice rising. "I trusted you. I believed you when you said you were traveling for work. But now I see I wasn't the only one." Margaret felt a wave of unexpected sympathy for Marie. She stepped toward the woman, her voice gentle. "Marie, I'm so sorry you had to find out this way. I didn't know if you knew about me." Marie turned to her, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I didn't," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought I was his only wife." The congregation sat in stunned silence as the two women, bound by their shared betrayal, stood united in their pain. Richard, cornered and exposed, looked around the room, his desperation evident. "Please, both of you, let's not do this here. We can talk about this privately." Margaret's voice was steady but resolute. "No, Richard. You don't get to hide anymore. This isn't just about me or Marie. This is about everyone you've deceived." Marie nodded, her voice gaining strength. "You've lied to both of us for years. We deserve answers, and your family deserves the truth." Sophie, still holding baby Emma, looked at her father with a mixture of hurt and anger. "I can't believe you would do this to Mom, to all of us." Mark shook his head, his jaw clenched. "You're a coward, Dad. A liar and a coward." The priest, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Perhaps we should conclude this ceremony another time," he said, looking at Sophie and Mark. "This is clearly a family matter that needs to be addressed." Margaret looked at her children, her heart breaking for the pain they were feeling. But she also felt a sense of vindication. The truth was finally out, and while it had shattered their lives, it had also set them free. She turned to Richard one last time, her voice calm but cold. "You've been exposed for who you really are, Richard. The only question now is how you plan to make this right, not for me, but for the people you've hurt." Richard lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of his actions had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping the consequences. The silence in the church felt suffocating. Margaret stood tall, her gaze fixed on Richard, who now looked like a man stripped of all his power. The congregation, once filled with whispers and murmurs, seemed to hold its collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. Margaret felt the weight of decades pressing down on her, but it was accompanied by an unfamiliar feeling: freedom. Marie took a hesitant step forward, her trembling hands clutching the back of a pew for support. "Did you ever love me, Richard?" she asked, her voice cracking under the strain of betrayal. Her words hung in the air like a challenge, daring him to answer truthfully. Richard finally raised his head, his face etched with regret, though not the kind that spoke of genuine remorse. It was the regret of a man who had been caught, his carefully curated life now unraveling in front of everyone he had worked to deceive. "I never wanted it to come to this," he said, his voice hoarse. "I didn't plan for any of this to happen." Margaret's laugh cut through his weak justification, sharp and bitter. "Didn't plan? You married another woman, Richard. You built an entirely separate life while pretending to be my husband. Don't insult us by pretending it was an accident." Marie's tears spilled over as she shook her head, disbelief shadowing her face. "So that's it? You're not even going to try to explain yourself?" Richard opened his mouth to speak, but was interrupted by Mark, whose voice rang with anger. "We don't want his excuses, Marie. He doesn't deserve to explain himself. He had his chance to be honest, and he chose to lie to all of us." Sophie, still holding Emma, looked at her father with a mixture of sorrow and rage. "You've broken this family, Dad. I don't even know who you are anymore." The words seemed to hit Richard like a blow, and for the first time, his shoulders sagged under the weight of his guilt. But Margaret wasn't ready to let him off the hook. Turning to the priest, she spoke with quiet dignity. "I'm sorry for interrupting this sacred ceremony, Father, but I couldn't stand here and let him continue to fool everyone, especially my children." The priest nodded solemnly, his kind eyes filled with understanding. "The truth, no matter how painful, must be revealed. This is a heavy burden to bear, and I pray you all find peace in the days ahead." Margaret looked at the congregation, seeing a mix of pity, shock, and quiet respect in their faces. She had braced herself for judgment, but instead she found a small measure of support. "Thank you," she said softly, before turning her attention back to Richard. "This isn't over, Richard, not by a long shot." As the ceremony came to an abrupt end, the guests began to file out of the church in stunned silence, their hushed conversations a mixture of disbelief and gossip. Margaret stayed back, watching as her children lingered by the altar, their expressions raw and conflicted. Sophie cradled Emma protectively, as if shielding her from the fractured family dynamic now on full display. Marie approached Margaret tentatively, her face a reflection of heartbreak. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I had no idea about you, about your family." Margaret softened, recognizing the shared pain between them. "You didn't know because he made sure you didn't. You're as much a victim in this as I am." The two women exchanged a look of understanding, a silent acknowledgement of their mutual betrayal. "What will you do now?" Marie asked hesitantly. Margaret squared her shoulders, her resolve unwavering. "I'm going to protect what's left of my family, and I'll make sure he pays for what he's done. Not just to me, but to all of us." Richard lingered near the doorway, looking as though he wanted to approach but couldn't muster the courage. Mark noticed and stormed over to him, his anger boiling over. "What do you even have to say for yourself?" he demanded, his voice echoing through the nearly empty church. "How could you do this to Mom, to us?" Richard held up his hands defensively, his voice pleading. "I made a mistake, Mark, a terrible mistake, but I love all of you." "Don't you dare say that," Mark interrupted, his voice shaking with emotion. "If you loved us, you wouldn't have done this. You lied to us, Dad, to all of us." Sophie joined them, her eyes red with tears. "This isn't just a mistake, Dad. This is years of lies, years of betrayal. How do we even begin to trust you again?" Richard's mouth opened and closed as he searched for words that wouldn't come. Margaret walked over, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos of the moment. "You can't fix this with words, Richard," she said firmly. "You've destroyed the foundation of this family, and there's no going back." Marie stepped forward, her voice trembling but resolute. And you've destroyed my life too, Richard. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. How many other secrets are you hiding?" Richard didn't answer. Instead, he looked down at the ground, his silence speaking volumes. For a man who had spent his life manipulating the truth, he had finally run out of words. Margaret placed a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder and looked at her children. "We'll get through this together," she said softly. "The three of us. We don't need him to define who we are as a family." The words seemed to bring a small measure of comfort to Sophie and Mark, who nodded, their resolve hardening. As Richard stood alone, watching the family he had shattered, Margaret turned her back on him, leading her children out of the church. It wasn't the ending she had envisioned, but it was a beginning, a new chapter where the truth would guide them, no matter how painful it had been to uncover. Outside the church, the crisp autumn air carried a heavy silence that clung to the group as they walked down the stone steps. Margaret clutched her purse tightly, the weight of the folder inside feeling lighter now that the truth was out. She glanced at Sophie and Mark, who walked on either side of her, their expressions a mix of anger and sadness. Baby Emma gurgled softly in Sophie's arms, blissfully unaware of the storm that had just erupted. Marie lingered a few steps behind, her presence an unspoken reminder of Richard's betrayal. She looked out of place among Margaret's family, yet there was an undeniable bond forming between her and Margaret, one forged through shared pain. "I don't know where to go," Marie said suddenly, her voice breaking the silence. Margaret turned to her, seeing the fear and confusion in her eyes. It was clear she had no plan for what came next, her world having been upended just as much as Margaret's. "You don't have to go anywhere right now," Margaret said softly. "This isn't your fault. You didn't ask for this any more than I did." Mark looked at his mother with a furrowed brow. "Are you seriously comforting her?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Margaret sighed, placing a hand on his arm. "She didn't know, Mark. She's as much a victim as we are. Blaming her won't fix what your father did." Mark shook his head, his jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. Sophie, meanwhile, reached out a tentative hand to Marie. "If you need help, I don't know, somewhere to stay or someone to talk to, we can figure something out," she offered, her voice hesitant but kind. Marie blinked back tears, nodding. "Thank you," she whispered, though her voice carried the weight of someone who felt deeply out of place. As the family walked toward their cars, Richard emerged from the church, his steps quick and purposeful. "Margaret, wait!" he called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Margaret stopped, turning to face him, her children flanking her protectively. "You've said enough, Richard," she said coldly, her voice cutting through the stillness. "There's nothing left for you to explain. I need to make this right," he said, desperation lacing his words. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've hurt all of you, but please don't shut me out." Mark stepped forward, his body tense with anger. "You made your choice, Dad. You didn't just hurt us, you lied to us for years. You don't get to just walk back into our lives like nothing happened." Richard looked at his son, his face crumpling. "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I didn't stop loving you or Sophie or Emma. Margaret raised her hand, silencing him. "Stop, Richard. Just stop. This isn't about your feelings or what you want anymore. It's about the damage you've done and the people you've betrayed." Sophie's voice trembled as she spoke. "Did you ever think about us when you were with her? Did you ever feel guilty about what you were doing?" Richard's silence was answer enough. Sophie let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Of course not. You didn't care about anyone but yourself." Marie, who had remained quiet until now, stepped forward, her expression resolute. "You told me I was the only one. You made me believe we had something real. How could you lie so easily?" Richard's gaze darted between Margaret and Marie, his face pale. "I didn't want to lose either of you," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's laugh was hollow and sharp. "You didn't want to lose us? You were never going to keep us, Richard. Not once the truth came out." The tension in the air was thick, the weight of Richard's deceit pressing down on everyone present. Margaret stepped closer to him, her voice calm but firm. "You've spent years living two lives, pretending to be someone you're not. Now you're going to face the consequences. You'll explain yourself to your other wife, your children, and the law if it comes to that. But I'm done." Richard opened his mouth as if to protest, but Margaret turned her back on him, her decision final. Sophie and Mark followed her lead, walking away without another word. Marie lingered for a moment, her gaze locked on Richard's face. "You don't deserve either of us," she said quietly, before turning and walking after Margaret. As the cars pulled away from the church, Richard stood alone on the steps, the reality of his shattered life sinking in. He had built his world on lies, and now it had crumbled around him, leaving him with nothing but the wreckage. The ride home was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft cooing of baby Emma in Sophie's arms. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window at the blur of autumn leaves, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mark, at the wheel, gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. The tension in the car was palpable, the weight of Richard's betrayal sitting like a storm cloud over them. Sophie finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Mom, how long have you known?" Margaret turned to face her daughter, her eyes softening at the sight of Sophie's tear-streaked face. "A few weeks," she admitted quietly. "I didn't want to believe it at first. I thought maybe it was a misunderstanding, but the evidence was undeniable." Mark let out a sharp exhale, his frustration spilling over. "Weeks? You've been sitting on this for weeks. You should have told us, Mum. We had a right to know." Margaret nodded, her voice calm but firm. "You're right. I should have told you sooner. But I needed to be sure. I needed to have proof before I turned our lives upside down. This wasn't easy for me, Mark." Sophie sniffled, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not your fault, Mom. None of this is your fault. He's the one who lied, not you." Margaret reached over and placed a hand on Sophie's knee, offering a small, sad smile. "Thank you, sweetheart. But part of me wonders if I missed the signs all these years. Maybe if I had paid closer attention, this wouldn't have happened." Mark shook his head vehemently, his voice edged with anger. "Don't do that, Mom. Don't blame yourself for his choices. This is on him, not you." The car fell into silence again, each of them lost in their thoughts. Margaret's mind raced with memories of her marriage, moments that now felt tainted by Richard's lies. She thought about their anniversary trips, their family dinners, the nights they stayed up talking about their dreams for the future. How much of it had been real? How much of it had been a carefully constructed performance? By the time they pulled into the driveway, the weight of the day had settled heavily on all of them. Margaret climbed out of the car slowly, her body aching from the emotional toll. Sophie followed, cradling Emma, while Mark slammed the car door shut, with a force that echoed through the quiet neighborhood. Inside, the house felt cold and unfamiliar. Margaret paused in the entryway, looking around at the photos on the walls, family vacations, birthdays, graduations. Each image was a snapshot of a life that now felt like a lie. She reached up and gently touched a photo of her and Richard on their wedding day, her fingers trembling. The young bride in the photo looked so full of hope, so certain of the life ahead of her. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as she whispered to herself, "I don't even know who that man was." Mark walked past her into the living room, pacing like a caged animal. "So what happens now?" he asked, his voice sharp. Do we just pretend he doesn't exist? Do we cut him out completely? Margaret sighed, following him into the room. I don't know, Mark. I don't have all the answers. But I do know that we need to take this one step at a time. Sophie sat down on the couch, bouncing Emma gently on her knee. Do you think he'll try to talk to us again? Try to explain himself? Margaret sat beside her daughter, her voice steady. Probably. He's not the type to walk away quietly. But we don't owe him anything, Sophie. Not after what he's done. Mark stopped pacing, his hands on his hips as he glared at the floor. I don't even want to hear his excuses. He can't undo what he did. He can't fix this. Margaret looked at her son, her heart aching for his anger and pain. I know you're hurt, Mark, and you have every right to be, but we need to focus on what's best for us now. We can't let him dictate how we move forward. The conversation lingered late into the evening, each of them grappling with the enormity of what had happened. By the time they finally went to bed, the house felt quieter than it ever had before, as if the weight of Richard's absence had already begun to settle in. The next morning, Margaret woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was a text from an unknown number. The message was simple, but chilling. We need to talk. It's not what you think. Her heart sank as she read the words, her mind immediately racing to Richard. She knew it had to be him, desperate to explain himself, to try and salvage whatever shred of dignity he thought he still had. Margaret set the phone down without replying, her jaw tightening. She had no intention of engaging with him, not yet. After getting dressed, she made her way downstairs to find Sophie and Mark already in the kitchen. Sophie was feeding Emma, her face still puffy from crying, while Mark sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. Morning, Margaret said quietly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Mark looked up, his expression grim. Dad texted me, he said flatly. He wants to meet. Says he needs to explain. Sophie nodded. He texted me too. I didn't reply. I don't even know what to say to him. Margaret sighed, sitting down at the table. He texted me as well. I don't think meeting him is a good idea right now. We're still processing everything. We don't owe him the chance to justify his lies. Mark frowned, his frustration evident. I don't want to meet him either, but part of me feels like I need to hear what he has to say. Not because I care about his excuses, but because I want to see him try to explain himself. I want to see him squirm. Sophie shook her head, her voice soft but firm. I don't think I can face him right now. It's too soon. I can't look at him and not think about what he's done to Mom, to all of us. Margaret placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder, her voice gentle. You don't have to do anything you're not ready for, Sophie. Neither of you do. But whatever we decide, we'll do it together. We'll face this as a family. The day passed slowly, the tension in the house thick and unrelenting. Margaret spent most of the afternoon going through old photo albums, sorting through the memories that now felt so bittersweet. She set aside the pictures of Richard, unsure if she could ever bring herself to look at them again. By evening, the decision was made. The three of them would confront Richard together, but on their terms. They agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a quiet park where they could speak without interruption. Margaret felt a mix of dread and determination as they prepared to face him. She knew this confrontation wouldn't bring closure, but it was a necessary step in reclaiming their lives. As they arrived at the park, the fading sunlight cast long shadows across the grass. Richard was already there, waiting on a bench with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked up as they approached, his face filled with regret and fear. Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. This was their moment to reclaim their power, to demand answers, and to finally begin the process of moving forward, together. as Margaret walked away from the shattered remnants of her marriage, flanked by her children and newfound strength. She realized that truth, no matter how painful, was the first step toward healing. Richard's lies had broken her world, but they couldn't define her future. In the quiet of the evening, she held her family closer, knowing that love, trust, and resilience would rebuild what deceit had tried to destroy. Want more gripping stories of resilience and uncovering the truth? Subscribe now and never miss a moment of inspiration and drama.